and the disciples, as whoever was gathered there with him, something very special at this point in Mark's gospel. He began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed. And then 3 days later, he would rise again. Jesus began to teach his apostles this. Now, when it says he began to teach this, that means he did not just tell them this one time, but this is a teaching that he began giving them at this point. And if you read through the rest of Mark's gospel, Mark records at least 9 different times when he spoke of this. Actually, he referred to it even more than that, but Mark records 9. And I'm inclined to believe he talked with them about it a lot more than that, even though Mark records 9 times. I think there were probably some more times. But we've got at least 9 from Mark, and all the gospel writers record some of these statements. Mark tends to record the most. But you know, this was controversial with the apostles. As a matter of fact, Peter didn't like it at all. It says in verse 32, he took him aside to rebuke him. Imagine that. The creator of the universe spoke everything into existence, and he's come down, the Son of God, and Peter is taking him aside to correct him. You ever see yourself in Peter? Because what Peter was hearing wasn't what he wanted to hear. He had an image that was not God's image in his mind of what the Messiah would be like and what the kingdom would be like, and so Peter's taking him aside to correct him. But turning around and seeing his disciples, what did Jesus do? He rebuked Peter, and this is how he rebuked him. He said, "Get behind me, Satan." We remember that, don't we? Why do we remember that? Because this is a big deal. When Jesus calls what we might even say is the head apostle, he wasn't, but he was, kind of, sort of. Everywhere Jesus went and he'd just take 3, who did he take? Peter, James, and John. Peter, James, and John. Peter, James, and John. I think that's how the rest of the apostles probably said it. But this is Peter. And Jesus is saying, "Get behind me, Satan." In other words, God's plan was for Jesus to do exactly what he's saying, to be arrested, to be mocked in a trial, to be crucified, to be buried and raised on the 3rd day. This was God's plan from the outset. This wasn't a secondary plan. This was the primary plan. It's always been this way. In Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15, remember what God said there to Satan? He said, "The seed of woman's going to come. He's going to bruise your head. You'll bruise his heel, but he will bruise your head." That's Genesis 3:15. And so here we have Jesus saying, "Yep, it's coming. This is what's going to happen." Then he says in verse 34, "If anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." Today, we think of the cross as a religious symbol, a Christian symbol. When he said that word cross, it wasn't a religious people in the minds of those who heard it. What was it? The cross was a means of death, and horrible death. Jesus said, "Take up your cross." For us, it would be like saying, you need to take up your hangman's noose. You need to take up your electric chair. You need to take up that syringe. Is that how you say that? Syringe with the poison in it that they inject people with to kill them? Because that's essentially what he was saying. You take up your cross, this means of death, and you follow him. They would never have thought, and I'm not criticizing those who do it today, because today people do it for a completely different reason, but they would never have thought of making a little golden image of the cross and hanging it around their neck or putting it on their ears. They would never have thought of that. They would never have thought of putting a cross in a place where they would assemble, because the cross was all about death. And Jesus says, anyone who wants to come after me, he's got to deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. What's he talking about? He's talking about dying, talking about death. He just began to teach them that he was going to die and raise the 3rd day. And he's telling his disciples, you've got to die too. Die to yourself and follow me. And then in chapter 9, Jesus was saying to them, verse 1, "Truly I say to you, some of those who are standing here who will not taste death till they see the kingdom of God after it has come with power." And 6 days after that, it says in verse 2, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John. There they are, Peter, James, and John. brought them up on a high mountain by themselves, and he was transfigured before them. What does that mean? That means he went from one figure to another figure. They saw the regular physical figure of Christ as they knew him in the flesh, and that changed. He was transfigured. Trans is a word that means you cross over, you go to something else. It's used in a bad context today because you're not really crossing over to anything that's real today when they use that word. But this was real. Jesus was transfigured. And it says his garments became radiant and exceedingly white, as no launder on earth can whiten them. And then it says, verse 4, Elijah appeared to them along with Moses. And they were talking with Jesus. So here's Peter, James, and John, and what are they seeing? They're up on this high mountain, and Jesus has changed. And he becomes shining white. His garments are whiter than anybody could ever have gotten them, and boom. I don't know if there was a boom, but in my mind there would have been a boom. That's Elijah. That's Moses. I don't know how they recognized these guys, but they recognized them. Peter would later say, oh, let's build 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Elijah, one for Moses. But wait a minute. How long had Elijah been dead? About 800 years. Elijah has been dead for 800 years, and there he is with Jesus. How long had Moses been dead? About 1,400 years, and there he is with Jesus. And these guys are seeing this. The reality of it was not mistaken, and it wasn't lost on them completely, though they weren't sure how to respond, obviously. So Jesus says, Son of Man's going to die and be resurrected the 3rd day. And you need to take up your cross, and you need to follow me. By the way, let me show you that these guys who've been dead for hundreds of years are not dead. They are still alive, and here they are with me. We're talking about the kingdom that's coming. Had these guys already seen any resurrections, by the way? Yeah, you go back in Mark's gospel right here, back to chapter 5. Read this in chapter 5 about a resurrection. Chapter 5 of Mark's gospel, verse 21, when Jesus had crossed over again in the boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him, so he stayed by the seashore. One of the synagogue officials named Jairus came up, and on seeing him, he fell at his feet. A synagogue official, one of the hierarchy of the Jews, humbled himself to fall at Jesus' feet. Why did he do that? He implored him earnestly, saying, my little daughter is at the point of death. Please come and lay your hands on her so that she will get well and live. Every parent in here, every grandparent knows why he fell on his feet. You do anything to help your children when they're sick. He asked Jesus to lay his hands on her so she'll get well and live. And he went off with them, and a large crowd was following him and pressing in on him. So he's on his way to Jairus' house to help his daughter. And it says in verse 25, this is almost like an aside, but not really. A woman who had a hemorrhage for 12 years and had endured much at the hands of many physicians, spent all that she had, was not helped at all, but rather had grown worse. After hearing about Jesus, she came up in the crowd behind him and touched his cloak, for she thought, if I just touch his garment, I will get well. And when she touched his garment, what does it say happened? She was made well. And Jesus stops and he says, wait a minute, who touched me? And the apostles are going, because these guys, they're just like me. I see myself in them. They're clues. Wait a minute, Lord, all these people around you, and somebody touches you and you say, who touched me? It's all these people crowding around you. How? It's like, no, you guys don't know. But Jesus knows. Somebody touched him, and this lady falls down, and she confesses what she's done. And what does Jesus say to her in verse 34? Daughter, your faith has done what? It's made you well. It's still happening. Faith is making us well. The more we believe, the more we practice that faith, the more well we become, the healthier our minds and our hearts get. Faith still makes us well. And so he's saying this to her. Her faith has made us well, or her well. And then it says in verse 35, while he was still speaking, telling her, your faith has made you well, it says, they came from the house of the synagogue official saying, your daughter's died. Why trouble the teacher anymore? It's over. Forget it. Your daughter's dead. Let's let Jesus get on about his business. Jesus, overhearing what was being spoken, said to the synagogue official, do not be afraid any longer, only believe. Do not be afraid. What do we fear? Do we fear death? I know there's a lot of things we fear, but one of the central things we fear is death. That's why I buckle my seatbelt. Oh, I'm pretty courageous. I don't buckle it when I'm just driving around Choctaw. But when I get out on that interstate, and I'm this far from an 18-wheeler going 500 miles an hour, the 18-wheeler, not me. I always do the speed limit. Yeah, you know how that works. Put that seatbelt on. Because I don't want to die. I don't want to be mangled. Jesus says, don't be afraid. They came to the house of the synagogue official, and he saw a commotion of people loudly weeping and wailing because they understand death. This little girl has died, and it hurts them. And entering in, he said to them, why make a commotion and weep? The child has not died, but is asleep. Now, can you imagine somebody saying that today? Somebody dies, and somebody comes, they're only sleeping. Yeah, you're a nut. That's what we would say today, and that's what they were thinking about him. He doesn't know what he's talking about. They didn't know who he was. They began laughing at him and putting them all out. He took along the child's father and mother and his own companions and entered the room where the child was. Taking the child by the hand, he said to her, Talitha Kumi. I think that's how you pronounce it, which translated means, little girl, I say to you, get up. You know what she did? She got up, resurrected from the dead. Jesus did this. His apostles saw it. They knew about it. They saw this resurrection. Again, you see, and this is in Luke 7. Mark doesn't record this particular instance, but in Luke chapter 7, he talks about being in this town called Nain, N-A-I-N. And as they were coming in, this procession was coming out. It was a funeral procession, and they were carrying a casket. And there was a body in there of a young man, the only son of a widow woman who had died. And Jesus touched the casket and told this kid to arise. You know what he did? He arose. And the apostles saw it. So he's telling them time after time, I'm going to be put to death, but I'm going to raise on the third day. Oh, by the way, let me raise Jairus' daughter from the dead to give you a little reason to believe. Let me raise this young man from the dead right out of his coffin, right out of his casket, so you can have reason to believe. By the way, I'm going to be transfigured up here, and you're going to see guys that have been dead for hundreds of years. Yeah, there's a resurrection. You better believe it. The power of the resurrection is what we put our hope in today. The power of the resurrection, the power of Jesus Christ, the power of his Father, the power of the Holy Spirit, the power of life is exactly what it is. And you know, we still haven't figured that out scientifically. We can't define what life is. We certainly haven't been able to manufacture it. Can't cause it to be in a laboratory. But this is all about life, even after death. Well, getting back to Mark's gospel, that was just the first time there in chapter 8. If you look over here, let's see, chapter 9. No, that's, chapter 9. I got to keep up with these. Verse 9. Mark 9, verse 9. They were coming down from the mountain. He gave them orders not to relate to anyone what they'd seen until the Son of Man rose from the dead. Can you imagine that? He's told them he's going to be crucified and rise from the dead. Now they're coming down from the mountain. They've seen Moses. They've seen Elijah. And he tells them when we're coming down, don't tell anybody about this until I raise from the dead. What? They seized upon that statement, discussing with one another what rising from the dead meant. And they asked him, saying, why is it that the scribes say that Elijah must come first? And he said to them, Elijah does come first and restore all things, and yet how is it written of the Son of Man that he will suffer many things and be treated with contempt? By the way, who was Elijah that would come first? It was John the Baptist. It was fulfilled in John the Baptist. Came in the spirit and power of Elijah. Well, over in chapter 9, verse 30. It says, from there they went out and began to go through Galilee, and he did not want anyone to know about it, for he was teaching his disciples and telling them, the Son of Man is to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and when he has been killed, he will rise 3 days later. This is the third time, and he's pretty specific. He's not beating around the bush. He's not mincing words. And it says again, he was teaching his disciples. It doesn't say that he taught them one time. He was teaching them. This is something that was on his lips to say to them, apparently many times and in many ways, to get this described. Well, go a little farther. Let's see, where's number 4? That's in chapter 10, verse 32. They were on the road to Jerusalem. Mark chapter 10, verse 32. On the road to Jerusalem, Jesus was walking on ahead of them, and they were amazed. Those who followed were fearful. Again, he took the 12 aside and began to tell them what was going to happen to him, saying, behold, we're going to Jerusalem. Son of Man must be delivered to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him and spit on him and scourge him and kill him, and 3 days later he will rise again. Can you imagine any of the apostles at this point saying, you know what, I'm not really sure, what does he mean by all that? Really? How specific does he have to be? And how many times will he have to say it? This is just the 4th time. Let me give you the rest of them. We won't go through all of them. But number 5 is in chapter 10, verse 45, where it says, even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. And then number 6 is in chapter 12, verses 1 through 11, where he talks about the vine growers, that the man planted a vineyard, and eventually they wound up killing his son so that they could have the benefits of that vineyard. And because of that, he would retaliate on them. That's the 6th time. And then if you look at chapter 14, you see it again here in verse 3. When he's in Bethany, he's at Simon's house. And this woman comes in with an alabaster vial of costly perfume, pours it on his head, anoints him, and people are criticizing her for wasting that vial of ointment on Jesus. And look what he says. Let her alone. This is chapter 14, verse 6. Why do you bother her? She's done a good deed to me. You've always got the poor with you, and whenever you wish, you can do them good. But you do not always have me. She has done what she could. She's anointed my body beforehand for the burial. What does that mean? I read this, and I have to wonder how much of what Jesus has said about his coming death and resurrection has this woman heard? Was she picking up on what he said? Did she understand? Because he is saying that she has anointed my body for the burial. Was that in her mind? It sounds like that's what he's saying. That she's taking to heart what he said. I don't know that, but I read this and I think maybe so. Maybe she got it. Maybe she understood. I know Jesus is defending her and what he's done, or what she's done. And he's saying she's done this for my burial. You know what he says after that? Did you read it? Read the next verse right after that. Truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is preached in the whole world, what this woman has done will also be spoken of in memory of her. When you understand what Jesus is doing, you make yourself a place in history. Your name, if you are in Christ, is written in the Lamb's eternal book of life. You have your place. It's like one lady said, you'll either have to be a good example or a horrible warning. I like that because that pretty much, that's the way it is. And this woman, she was a good example. The 8th time, let's see if we can find it here. Chapter 14, 17 to 18. Where are we? There it is. When it was evening, he came with the 12. They were reclining at table. And Jesus said, you know what he does? This is the Lord's Supper. What's the Lord's Supper predicated on? The Lord's Supper is predicated on him giving his body for it to be crucified, him giving his blood for it to be shed, not spilt, not accidentally. This is an intentional shedding of blood that God has intended since before the foundation of the world. And Jesus is giving us this memorial. That's why it's such a focal point of worship, to remember what Jesus has done for us. Well, that's number 8. The 9th time. Verse 27. Jesus said to them all, "You'll all fall away because it's written." And then he quotes Old Testament scripture. "I will strike down the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. But," he says, "after I have been raised, I'll go ahead of you to Galilee." So here's 9 times. 9 times that Jesus tells them. Let me ask you, how many of these guys were waiting in the cemetery where Jesus was buried on the 3rd day? And I don't ask that question to be critical. I ask that question because God is painting us a word picture here that gives me hope. Everything that Jesus showed them, everything that Jesus taught them, the resurrections that he performed, letting Peter, James, and John see Moses and see Elijah. Nobody had been able to see those guys for hundreds of years, but they saw them because they weren't dead. Their bodies were in the ground, but they were not dead. And he tells them over and over and over, "I'm going to die, but I won't be dead. I'm going to raise the 3rd day." Told them that. And they still weren't there on the 3rd day. And I think, yeah, there's hope for me. There's not only hope for me, it's a sure hope. Jesus knew this would be the way it was. And he knew you would be the way you are and I would be the way I am, but we're still inclined to faith because as imperfect and as messed up as we are, Jesus is the only hope. He's the only one who's ever come up out of the grave by his Father raising him. All those other folks, Jairus' daughter, bless her heart, you know what happened to her later? She died. That widow's son, you know what happened to her later? Or him? He died too. We didn't even talk about Lazarus. My goodness, Lazarus had been in the grave for 4 days. You know what his sisters said about him? His loving, sweet sisters said about Lazarus? "He's been buried for 4 days, Lord. He stinks." They knew the reality of death and corruption, but they didn't understand. They were talking to the Lord of life. What did Jesus say? "I am the way. I am the truth. I am the life." And that's who he was, and that's who he is. And so he is putting up with us like he put up with them. He fulfilled Genesis 3:15. He was the Lion of the tribe of Judah, as well as Jacob blessed his son Judah in Genesis chapter 49. He was the prophet like unto Moses that Moses talked about in Deuteronomy chapter 18. He was the fulfillment of the Passover lamb that was sacrificed there in Exodus chapter 12 and 14. He was the fulfillment of so many Old Testament passages that he's the one. He's the one. Today, the question is, are you and I inclined to faith? Not a perfect faith. We struggle, do we not? But do we still believe in Jesus? That's what you trade for righteousness. God will give you righteousness based on that. And it's all based on him fulfilling everything he said. Today, we're going to sing a song of encouragement and invitation. If you still put your faith in Jesus Christ and you're ready to be buried in water, baptized in his name, you can rise to walk in newness of life, and that resurrection will be yours. Let's stand and sing for anybody who wants to avail themselves of that promise.
I'm pressing on the upward way, new heights I'm gaining every day, but still as I onward bound, Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. Lord, lift me up and let me stand by faith on heaven's stable land. A higher plane than I have found. Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. My heart has no desire to stay where doubts arise. and fears dismay, though some may dwell where these abound. My prayer, my aim is higher ground. Lord, lift me up and let me stand by faith on heaven's table land, a higher plane than I have found. Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. I want to live above the world, though Satan's darts at me are hurled. For faith has caught the joyful sound, the song of saints on higher ground. Lord, lift me up and let me stand by faith on heaven's table land, a higher plane than I have found. Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. I want to scale the utmost height and catch a gleam of glory bright, but still I'll pray till heaven I found. Lord, lead me on to high